Chapter 15. Allie. Ben sat up halfway in bed, then winced as a stab of pain through his still healing torso informed him that that had been an extremely stupid idea. It was frustrating to be injured like this. It had been almost a week since the confrontation on the road to Sanguine, and he was still not completely healed. He knew humans didn't heal quite as quickly as wolves did. It was some kind of crappy biological reality. He wasn't exactly sure on the details. But humans must be patient when they got hurt. How long could someone lie in bed watching Netflix? Well, it depended on the company, he supposed, as the door creaked open and Allie came padding into the room in her pajamas. Her hair was up in a messy bun and her face was soft when she looked at him, and for the millionth time that week, he felt such love for her well up in his chest that he almost hurt his face trying to smile as widely as he could at her. What are you grinning at, you doofus? Nothing. Just missed you. You're a mess, she chuckled, sitting on the edge of the bed and crossing her legs. Seriously, I'm gonna have to go home sooner or later. Half my stuff's there. Boo, he groaned, rolling theatrically away from her across the bed, careful not to interfere too much with his bandages. She'd scold him if she had to change them for him again. The more superficial scrapes and bruises had thankfully already healed, but the deep gouges in his torso were taking their sweet time about it, and Allie insisted on cleaning and dressing the wounds every morning or whenever he, in her words, messed up the bandages like an idiot. You would leave me, a gravely injured man, on my very deathbed. It'll be your deathbed in a minute, buddy, she growled, eyes sparkling to take the sting out of the threat. She was formidable. He'd known she was a powerful wolf since they were teenagers, of course, but seeing her shift that day on the road, watching her tear herself out of that hateful wedding dress, definitely ranked among the most awe-inspiring moments of his life. Kind of a turn on, if he was honest, though at the time he'd absolutely had other things on his mind, like murdering the scumbag that had schemed to marry his lover against her will. There had been something very satisfying in finally meeting the guy who'd tormented her so, in finally getting to tear him apart, quite literally. Nobody was sure what had happened to him in the end. Presumably, he'd shifted back after the alpha fight had concluded, and other wolves had reported seeing him driving away in his car, but after that nobody had heard anything. Ben wasn't sure if he was happier not knowing whether he'd killed the other wolf. Sometimes he hoped he had. Other times he hoped he hadn't. It was strange, not knowing exactly how much blood was on his hands. At least he knew Allie was safe. That was all he cared about in the end. The moment he'd seen her standing by the side of the road in a wedding dress, he'd felt such fear and dread that he'd almost passed out. Then Naomi had pulled the car over and he'd run to her. And it was the most natural thing in the world to fight to protect her. His lover. His soulmate. What are you staring at? She asked, and he started realizing he'd been staring at her with a soft expression on his face for the better part of 5 minutes. He ducked his head, grinning embarrassment, and she lay back on the bed, arranging herself carefully in the crook of his arm where she wouldn't accidentally put any pressure on his wounds. You, he answered her finally, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. How does your hair always smell that good? My conditioner is very expensive, she murmured back. A high-maintenance woman. You couldn't afford me, grocery boy. He huffed laughter, wincing as it tugged at the wounds a little. I am a small business owner, Allie. I'm the backbone of the local economy. Yeah. Speaking of money, I don't know what to do about my job. Ben's smile faded a little. They hadn't talked a lot about what had happened. Allie had been too worried about his injuries in the wake of the battle. Naomi had brought him and Allie back here to Ben's place where Alan had been waiting for them. The man knew everything there was to know about how wolves healed, and he'd confirmed that Ben was seriously hurt, but would make a full recovery so long as he rested and kept his wounds clean. Allie had taken these instructions a little more seriously than Ben was happy with, if he was honest. But it was just so good to have her around all the time that he couldn't complain too much. But they hadn't talked about what had happened in the aftermath of the battle. With Nicholas dead, Rex expressed flat disinterest in taking over the running of the Sanguine pack. He'd stopped by to check on Ben the day after the battle, and Ben had never seen a man who looked so tired. Are you okay, Rex? He'd asked, the haze of the painkillers making him bold. Enough to ask a question he'd never have asked of his alpha sober. Rex had just sighed. I'd hoped never to have to do that again. That's all. I'm sorry, Ben had said, voice low. It's a lot of this is my fault. I should never have left, Rex. I'm so sorry. Rex had stared at him, and Ben had looked him right in the eye for a shocked moment. Sorry? Ben, you saved our pack from being destroyed by those madmen. You have nothing to apologize for. You're a valued member of this pack. And so is Allie if she chooses. That had been a surprise. He'd wondered what they'd talked about for so long. In his living room, the door closed so he couldn't overhear what their murmuring voices were saying. The idea of Allie joining the Fel, coming to live with him permanently perhaps, was too good to be true. He'd hoped desperately that she'd bring it up later after Rex had gone home for some well-deserved rest. But she hadn't mentioned it, so he'd let the subject lie. After all, it was a big decision, leaving your pack for another one. He should know. From what Ben could gather from local gossip, it seemed that Allie's father had taken over as alpha. At first, the idea of that cold man running the Sanguine pack was a little frightening. Surely he'd be interested in finishing what Nicholas had started in taking over their pack. No, he won't, Allie had said when they talked about it the night before. He stroked her hair as she lay against him, aware that the topic of her parents was still a sore subject. He's an ambitious man, but he's not that kind of ambitious. If it won't improve business, he's not interested. The only reason he wanted to take over Fel was that Darius wanted to take over Fel, and Darius had business for him. He'll be a decent alpha, and he'll leave Fel alone. She'd sighed, and there'd been a long silence until she spoke again. I'm just worried about my mother. Now he squeezed her to his side with his arm, pressing another kiss to her sweet-smelling hair. Your job? Yeah. I mean, obviously it's all a bit. She made a vague gesture with her hand. Dad won't return my calls, but my work email account's still active, and I'm still getting messages from clients who think it's business as usual. So I don't know. Do you want to keep working there? Ben asked, resisting the urge to tell her to quit her job and lie in bed with him until they both died of laziness. He had a feeling that would be unhelpful at this stage. Would you go back to all that? I dunno. I'm really good at it, she said, sounding wistful. And I spent so much of my life there. You could be good at it somewhere else though, right? He sat up a little, looking down at the top of her head as she gazed meditatively out of the window. You're brilliant, we all know that, and if you can work your magic, even when your asshole dad is getting in the way all the time, imagine what you could do by yourself. You're not wrong. And hey, if that doesn't work out, you can always come work at the grocery store, he joked. He wasn't expecting Allie to glance up at him, her eyes suddenly interested. Really? Well, we've got plenty of room in the budget for an extra employee. I just always picked up the extra shifts because I've had nothing better to do, he said. You're not seriously interested though? It's just a grocery store. Tiny little business. Beneath your expertise, surely. There's no such thing as a tiny business, Allie informed him, her eyes gleaming. Just small ambitions. When do I start? I thought I couldn't afford you, he said, a little taken aback by her enthusiasm for this idea but happy at the prospect of getting to work alongside her. Well, we haven't even started the salary negotiations yet, she said, smiling at him with a suddenly seductive glint in her eye. He felt himself respond immediately, almost embarrassingly fast, and it must have shown on his face, because a wicked grin spread across her face as she rose to her knees on the bed beside him. Ben sat up to kiss her, reaching out to cup the back of her neck in his hand, but Allie protested, pressed him back down until he was lying against the pillows. Do I have to tie you down? She asked, one eyebrow raised. No moving around until you're healed, remember? One of her hands was on his thigh, idly tracing patterns that he could feel through the thin fabric of his pajamas, and he could feel his body responding to her, could feel the need to hold her, kiss her, beginning to pound in his chest with his heartbeat. That's it, she said as he sat up in bed again to kiss her, striding across the room to his wardrobe and extracting the belt he'd been wearing that night at the club when they'd first reconnected. Ben stared at her as she came back to the bed, confusion warring with arrival. Are you going to hit me with a belt? He asked, one eyebrow raised. She scoffed. Only as a last resort. and then ever so casually she looped the belt around his wrists and restrained them to the headboard of the bed. "There," she said with some satisfaction as he tugged at the restraint. "That'll keep you from tearing your wounds open again. Now where were we?" He groaned as she pressed a line of kisses down the side of his neck, tugging ineffectually at his hands where he was restrained. This was maddening, but he could hardly complain as she ever so lightly tugged down the waistband of his pajama pants, freeing his manhood, and he bucked his hips a little as she hovered, applying tiny gentle kisses to the parts of his torso that weren't swathed in bandages. But it wasn't long before she relented and took him into her mouth. "Allie," he gasped minutes or hours later. It was impossible to tell, so completely had his awareness condensed down to the single point of this beautiful woman and what she was doing to him. "You're going to kill me." "Hope not," she murmured, moving up beside him, and he realized that at some point she'd taken both of their pants off. Carefully, gently, and with a firm instruction not to hurt himself, she straddled his waist and joined their bodies together. With a cheeky smile, she leaned across and pulled his hands free of the belt. He groaned in relief, grabbing her face and pulling her down into a passionate, bruising kiss that made her catch her breath. They moved together, carefully at first, and then with more and more enthusiasm, and if the pace of their lovemaking was making his injuries worse, well, he supposed he'd just have to spend another few days in bed recovering. What a shame that would be, he thought as he heard Allie's breath picking up in that telltale way it had when she was close. Some things hadn't changed since their teenage love affair. He held out as long as he could, and then, when it became too much to bear, he murmured in her ear, teeth gritted, and they both crashed over the edge together, gasping for breath. "Ben," Allie murmured in his ear an impossible to measure length of time later, and he smiled, turning to sleepily kiss her face. "Just wait until these dumb wounds heal. We're never going to leave this bed." Allie laughed, and the sound of it was like the sun coming out. Chapter 16. Allie frowned down at the documents open before her on her laptop. Why did getting property have to be such an irritatingly complicated process? The situation seemed simple. There had been a big plot of empty land right next to the grocery store that had apparently been untouched since before Ben took over the running of the place. So why did it have to be so tedious and irritating to apply for the rights to expand the store into the plot? They could do with the space. It was a good little store and very well organized, but it had been built back when there were a maximum of 2 different brands of each product. These days they were in sore need of expansion, and Allie was full of all kinds of ideas, but first she needed the space. She hadn't even touched on the paperwork associated with expanding the old building. They'd need to take the back wall down and probably the east one as well. She'd met with a few contractors about the scope of the work and they were confident it could be done, but still it was going to be a bit of a headache. Allie grinned to herself. She loved this stuff. Ever since Ben had jokingly offered to hire her at the store, even he had been taken aback by the extent of her ambition and plans for the place. His father had built a solid business, and Allie knew exactly how to expand on those solid foundations. The man had come slouching into the store a few weeks ago, ostensibly to check up on Ben, but she could tell it was really in the interest of meeting her. He was a grumpy old guy for sure. Meeting him was an excellent lesson in why Ben had turned out the way he was, strong and reliable, but with a nervous undercurrent that could only come with the kind of parental pressure he'd been under. Grumpy dads. Maybe that was why they got on so well. But she'd talk shop with the old wolf for a few minutes, and as Ben had reported later, it seemed like she'd won him over. Good thing too. She'd moved in with Ben officially not long after his wounds finished healing. Just seemed silly to keep paying rent on her place when she had no interest in ever going back there again. Not when Ben was here and fell and seemed happy enough to let her stay with him as long as she wanted. He said his place had always felt a little big for one person, but he'd threatened her that she'd have to keep her things neat. She'd agreed, laughing, then quietly moved all his things around when he'd gone out. Watching him try to figure out what she'd done had been one of the funniest experiences of her life. It had been 3 months since the fight, and relations between Sanguine and Fel were still strained. Under the new alpha, her father, it seemed that Sanguine wolves had been forbidden from visiting Fel for any reason, which honestly wasn't a bad move, given how much suspicion there still was in the smaller pack. Word had spread quickly about the attempted attack on Fell territory, and though there was ostensibly a renewed truce between the packs, there was definitely a strong attitude of distrust. Thank God it didn't extend to the newest Fell member, Allie thought to herself, smiling. Rex had offered her a place in the pack the first time he'd come by Ben's place to check up on how his wounds were healing. The alpha was hurt too. She caught a glimpse of some bandages peeking out from under his shirt, and he carried himself in a stiff way that indicated some deeper injuries. She'd been a little afraid of him, honestly, but he asked after how she was going, listened sincerely and honestly to her replies, and even though she kept waiting for the inevitable switch to manipulation, or bossing her around, it never came. What do you plan on doing next? Rex had asked. She jumped, a little wary. Was this some kind of test? I'm not sure, she admitted. But if you'd like me to leave town, I'm happy to. Of course not. He'd cut her off, looking shocked. Leave town? Thanks to you and Ben, we received prior warning of an attack that could very well have spelled the end of the whole pack. We owe you a tremendous debt, Alexandra. Not only are you more than welcome to stay here as long as you like, but I've also spoken to the elders of the pack, and we're in complete agreement that you'd be a valuable asset to the pack proper. If you would be willing to join us, we'd be delighted to welcome you as a member of the pack. She'd stared at him, taken aback by the generosity of the offer. Are you sure? Rex had winked. Last time I took in a sanguine wolf, it ended pretty well for us. But it's your choice. I'll give you some time to think. Don't feel like you need to answer straight away. So she had a house, a job, and a permanent place in the pack if she wanted it. Her time in Sanguine was already beginning to feel like a strange dream. To think she'd spent so much of her life trying so desperately to please an alpha, who, it was becoming clear, had been deeply manipulative and power-driven. The contrast was clear with Rex, who actually cared about his pack. He'd stopped by several more times during Ben's recovery despite his own wounds, and when Allie had talked it over with Ben, and with Naomi, who'd received a similar offer from Rex to join the pack, and called Rex to let her know she'd be gratefully accepting his offer, they had a dozen more visitors within the week, all well-wishers from the neighborhood and the pack wanting to offer their thanks. She must have put on 5 pounds in a week from all the delicious baked goods that the Fell Wolves brought over as welcome and thanks. It was amazing how quickly she'd settled in. Allie reflected now, staring out the glass window of the break room in the grocery store. It had become her unofficial office. There was a kettle nearby, which meant she could keep making cup after cup of tea to keep her energy up, and it was nice and quiet. Ben kept saying he was going to clear space in the actual office for her to work in, but she didn't mind so much. His father had kept handwritten records for years and years, even after computer technology would have made it a lot simpler to just digitize, and Ben was trying to clear it all out, but it was slow going. And Ben had enough on his plate these days. It was good timing that she'd taken over a little of the running of the grocery store, because Rex was leaning on Ben more and more in the day-to-day running of the pack. Her boyfriend made a great politician, she thought proudly. His years in a customer service role meant he knew everyone in town well, and had a really good instinct for what the pack needed and wanted to change in the community. Rex and Ellen appreciated his help. He'd come such a long way from the scared 18-year-old who'd run to Sanguine in the middle of the night, unsure of who he was or what the future held. No longer were Fell Wolves distrustful of him. He'd more than earned his place in the pack. She told him every day how proud she was of what he'd done with himself. She looked up as the break room door opened. Tyler was in the doorway waiting politely for her to be done with what she was working on before he spoke. There was another big surprise. Ever since the day of the fight, when in desperation Ben had called Tyler to run the store by himself, the kid had surprised the hell out of him. Not only had he turned up and opened the grocery store, but he'd also run it just fine all day, showing an astonishing amount of leadership for such a young kid. He'd even managed to run the place solo while Ben recovered from his injuries, with even Ben's dad, who went in to check on the place, forced to admit that he was doing a great job. Now he fidgeted with his shiny new assistant manager badge as he waited for Allie. "What's up, Tyler? There's someone here for you. Says you have a lunch date." "Oh shit." Allie slammed her laptop shut, realizing how late it had gotten. while she was immersed in figuring out the intricacies of expansion. Naomi. Sure enough, there was her best friend, examining an artfully arranged stand of tomato tins while she waited for Allie. Naomi looked great. Like Allie, she'd chosen to leave sanguine after the fight. A good move probably given that she'd not exactly made a lot of friends by siding with fell wolves in the battle. And though Rex had offered her a place in fell, saying they could use a few more wolves with her pluck in their ranks, she'd politely turned him down. I'm sick of being a rank-and-file wolf ALS, she'd confided when the two women had gotten together late one night for a bottle of wine and a heavy debrief. Rex is a good alpha for sure. I could do a lot worse, but I just want to be on my own for a bit, you know? I'm tired of pack politics. She'd snapped up an empty old farmhouse in the countryside, well outside of the territory limits for both fell and sanguine. It wasn't unheard of for wolves to live alone, but it was a little strange they were so hardwired for communal living. Still, if anyone could do it, it was Naomi. And Allie had to admit, since she'd moved out there, she was looking great, strong and fit, and there was an openness in her face that hadn't been there when she was living under Nicholas's rule. How's the farm? Allie asked when they were settled in a booth at their new favorite restaurant in Fell, food on its way over to them. You're not going stir crazy out there all by yourself yet, are you? Naomi laughed. I'm loving it, ALS. I've got chickens. Fresh eggs every morning. It's bliss, really. I'm glad, babe. You deserve it. She shook a warning finger at her best friend. Just keep in touch, you hear? Speaking of going crazy, have you heard from your parents yet? Allie sighed. That one was a bit of a sore subject. Not since Dad took over as Alpha. I sent my resignation to his work email. No response, but he deactivated my email account and none of my logins work anymore, so I guess that's final. He won't return any of my calls. I got one weird text from my mother last week saying I could come home just as soon as I left Ben. But you don't want to go home or leave Ben, Naomi said blankly. What kind of trade-off is that? That's what I said. And I haven't heard from her since. So I guess that's that. You okay? You know I am? It's weird. I thought I'd be sad to lose touch with my parents, but I just feel free. Naomi reached over the table and squeezed her hand. And Ben? How's he doing? Great. Allie smiled. Rex has him helping out with the pack on a permanent basis now. He's really found a place for himself. He needed that. Hey, I know I've always given you shit about him, Naomi said a little hesitantly. But I just wanted to say, and don't you dare tell him I said this, but I reckon he's okay. Oh my God, nay. Just okay. That's all. And if he puts a single foot wrong, I'll rip his throat out, alright? So just make sure he deserves you, that's all. You're going soft in your old age, Naomi, Allie teased her, and Naomi flicked her napkin at her, laughing. They spent the rest of lunch chatting happily before they parted ways, Naomi heading back to her farm, Allie on her way back to work. It felt good to be going back to a job she actually liked. Lunch with Naomi had always been the only thing that got her through the day. Now it was just one more bright spot among a constellation of bright spots. That started with waking up in Ben's arms and finished with falling asleep with him. Speak of the devil, she thought to herself, grinning. His car was in the parking lot of the grocery store. When she got to the doors, he was waiting for her, looking freshly shaved and a shade more sharply dressed than he usually did. Is that a new shirt? Can you take the afternoon off? He asked, stepping in to kiss her on the cheek. You tell me, boss man. We both know I basically work for you at this stage, he replied, his eyes crinkling in that gorgeous way they did when he smiled. Your words, not mine. But yeah, I can take the afternoon off. What's up? Pack stuff. Ben had been busier than usual lately. He'd been absent for a good chunk of the weekend, which was quite unlike him. Nope. Pack stuff's done for the week. I wanted to take you somewhere. Make up for my absence last weekend. I've just had lunch with Naomi. Hot chocolate, then? She studied him, a little suspicious. There had been something a little too quick about the way he'd spoken, almost as though he'd planned this conversation ahead of time. Almost as though Naomi had picked today to take her out to lunch on purpose. It wasn't her birthday anytime soon, and it wasn't their anniversary. What was going on? But she was always a sucker for hot chocolate. So after giving him a good long suspicious glance, which he returned with his very best expression of complete innocence, Allie got in the passenger seat of his car. He took them to a little restaurant just outside of town. She laughed aloud as she recognized it. This had been one of their favorite places to go when they were teenagers. She'd make up some excuse to borrow her dad's car and pick him up. Then they'd have a romantic moonlit drive to this little dessert restaurant that was open late. But it's the middle of the afternoon. Are they even open during the day? Your boyfriend's a powerful guy, Allie, he said solemnly, pulling into the parking lot. And sure enough, when they walked up to the automatic door, it slid open for them. It was as cute as she remembered, cozy and close with an ornate fireplace and lots of intimate two-person tables. Allie's mouth dropped open as she looked for their favorite booth. There it was, the table already set, complete with a miniature chocolate fountain and a range of pieces of fruit to dip in it. There was even a candle burning. They sat down together, and Ben chuckled as she set about dipping every single piece of fruit on her side of the plate in the chocolate and devouring it. Oh Ben, it's even better than I remember, she said around a mouthful of raspberry and chocolate. This is amazing. Thank you. Glad you took the afternoon off? So glad. She licked chocolate off her fingers, not even caring how ridiculous she looked. I did want to talk to you about something. Oh sure. I can multitask. Is it the expansion? I know you think it's ambitious, but seriously, we need at least 3 extra aisles if we want to look into stocking all that extra product I mentioned. I trust you, he said simply. She frowned a little, aware of the way he was looking at her, that slightly goofy smile on his face, the soft expression in his eyes. What are you looking at? Do I have chocolate on my nose? Allie, I've loved you since we were 18. She blinked at him, startled into silence by the tone in his voice. I know it's only been a few months since we reconnected, but as far as I'm concerned, I've been in love with you for 10 years. So if anything, this is kind of overdue. And steadily, he pushed a small black box across the table towards her. Allie stared at him, her eyes wider than they'd ever been, then down at the box. There, nestled against the black velvet, was the most beautiful ring she'd ever seen in her life. I got Naomi's approval on the design, he was saying as she reached for the box with trembling fingers. Ben, I took one of your rings in to get the right size, but they can change it if it's not quite. Ben, and if you don't like the design, tell me seriously, we can. He was fidgeting with his hand again, that old nervous gesture he'd never quite grown out of. Ben, what's wrong? I'm covered in chocolate, I can't. She laughed, giddy, gesturing at him with her chocolate-covered fingers. Yes, I'll marry you, you idiot. I just don't want to get chocolate all over this beautiful ring. Oh my God, of course I'll marry you, Ben. You're the love of my life, I can't believe. And then he was up, reaching for her, pulling her into his arms and laughing with acute relief in his voice. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, giggling, heedless of the chocolate she was getting on his shirt. They broke apart and stared at each other for a long moment, completely oblivious to the rest of the world, and Allie knew at that moment that whatever happened, pack politics, family altercations, shifter dramas, come what may, with Ben at her side, she could take on the world. It had taken them 10 years to find their way back to each other, and she couldn't wait to finally start their life